salvation be exalted. The Lord is blessed, and blessed be my rock. Let the Lord of my salvation be exalted.
Hello, my name is Wanda Skowronska. I've come from Australia. I'm in St Lucia for a few days, and very pleased to be able to talk to you about something dear to my heart, spiritual adoption of the unborn child. It may sound a strange thing, but imagine if you could do something in the world in which we live, where we know there is a lot of evil happening, and that thing is quite easy to do, and that at the end of your life you could go into the next world, having helped people in some very particular way. St. John Paul II said in Evangelium Vitae that the new prospects opened up by scientific and technological progress have given rise to new forms of attacks on the dignity of the human person. I don't need to tell you this, you know this. In the past decades we've seen the growth of IVF, surrogacy, RU486, experimentation on human beings as if they were just pieces of flesh or pieces of wood. In fact, St. John Paul II described our age as one of the darkest moral blindness. Pretty powerful words to use. And he said we call evil good and good evil, and you can see this in the tendency to just downplay things like witchcraft or the occult, or to just joke about it as if it means nothing. In our age, he said, faced with all the countless grave threats to life present in the modern world, you could feel overwhelmed. And those Catholics of goodwill out there, genuine, sincere Catholics, often can feel overwhelmed by powerlessness and wondering, what can we do in the face of this? Many of our normal activities are in a context where at the local chemist, the chemist will sell the contraceptive pill which can cause abortions, and that is a fact. Sells post-abortion or post-birth pills, morning after pills and so on. This evil coexists with a kind of a difference and a kind of a moral paralysis on our parts. And many of us just start to kind of criticize things in the modern world, in the church, and we'll say it's, well, this particular priest, this bishop, this movement, it's this particular thing, and we can't do anything about it. And you find what happens is people get very upset and angry quickly when they're faced by a lot of evils. And that edginess is on the increase in the church because people aren't quite sure of what clearly to believe. And they're not being told often clearly what it is they must follow, so they tend to everyone becomes infallible, and we've got so many infallible little popes running around it. It's because of the age and the times and the confusion. However, we have the desire to do something in the darkness. And Pope John Paul II said in the encyclical Evangelium Vitae, again quoting from it, he said, "Never cease trying to overcome evil with love and to do spiritual good." He said, never be overcome by the prevailing darkness and despondency. Now, when we look around the fact that 54 million abortions or more are done each year surgically, and that many others are done chemically, we think, what can we do about it? I have something that you can do about it, and it's really very, very easy. It's spiritual adoption of an unborn child. It's been given an imprimatur. St. John Paul II loved this movement. It's rescuing a child out there who you are catching in your heart, in your spiritual arms. So what's involved in it? This is where you think she's going to ask for money or a form. No, I'm not. It doesn't involve any money. It involves no written forms. It's a prayer for the unborn, and it's very short every day. Spiritual adoption involves a short prayer initially, takes all of 1 minute, just asking to adopt the child. And I have it written down here, and we'll leave copies here. And then every day saying a decade of the Rosary with a short prayer in front of it. That's all. That's all. Nothing further. You do that for 9 months. Now, the reason it's done for 9 months is that every life is so precious. You can't just say, I'm going to spiritually adopt 1,000 children and pray for them all. No, each one of us is unique, made in the image of God. Each one of us is so precious, 9 months in the mother's womb. And so we pray for 9 months for one child. We may not know who that child is. God alone knows who it is. And that child whom you pray for is linked to you for all eternity. You think that. You think what that means, that you are adopting that child. These children don't want your money. They don't want your, books and academic treatises. They want you to remember them. They are the invisible asylum seekers of our time. How did this movement begin? Spiritual adoption of the unborn child has an interesting history. Very recently, actually, it started in communist Poland. With the encouragement of the Pauline priests, they wear white robes, like the Dominicans. And they're the people who are concerned with the preservation of the shrine of Our Lady of Częstochowa, which is in Poland, in the centre of Poland, in Częstochowa. And they take care of many other Marian shrines around the world. Many people, of course, prayed for unborn children previously, but this was a formalised way of it starting. Now, in Częstochowa, Our Lady's help has been called on for many grave situations. I don't need to tell you that Poland's history has been a very tortured one in the last 300 years. In World War II, Poland lost a fifth of its population. Recently in America, George Weigel, the biographer of St. John Paul II and his life, he has written 2 volumes about him, said, no one can possibly understand the turbulence and the tribulation of these times where you woke up in the morning and you really didn't know if you were to be alive at night or not. My own father went through this. He was a soldier in the resistance army, the Armia Krajowa in Poland, and he didn't know if he would be alive in the evening. In the morning, he fought in the battle of the Warsaw Uprising, was shot twice, 2 bullets, but he obviously lived because I'm a living witness to that. In any case, there has been a lot of war and fighting in Poland because Poland has large neighbours. At one point in the 17th century, the Swedish army invaded Poland, and they wanted to make Poland a Protestant country. So they invade, and they succeeded. Warsaw was overcome, and the Protestant army was moving further south until they reached a place called Częstochowa, which is on a hill called Jasna Góra, all these Polish words. But there, the monks and the townspeople decided to band together and have resistance to this invading Swedish army. And what they did with their fewer weapons and fewer sort of means of fighting this enemy, they set up their quarters. The Swedes were the kind of modern hip army. They had all the latest equipment. And the Poles set up their cannons, and the monks came out and even at some points were praying near the cannons and had their arms up in blessings, hoping the cannonball would go to the right place, because without that, Częstochowa would be obliterated. And the battle raged on, and with no clear explanation of how this all happened, except for the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Częstochowa, the much larger Swedish army was defeated. It was something like the Poles were outnumbered like 4-1 or something like that. Very, very large odds. Afterwards, apparently, the Swedes, in their records of this battle, commented that they felt really spooked because they saw a lady on the ramparts walking around directing the battle. No Pole saw this, no monk saw this, but the Swedes, who didn't believe in Catholicism, they saw this. So it's an interesting little aside. In any case, what happened, the king was so overwhelmed by the fact that the people of Częstochowa had defeated the Swedish army. He said that from henceforth in Poland, the Virgin Mary would be officially designated as the Queen of Poland. And so he made what they call the Jasna Góra vows, and he vowed that Poland would have the Virgin Mary as the Queen for all eternity. Now, it's this order of monks, the Pauline monks associated with this, who first started encouraging spiritual adoption of the unborn child. And interestingly, it wasn't too long after that, from Częstochowa, that King Sobieski went with an army from Poland to Vienna and defeated the Turks in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna, which then prevented Europe becoming Islamic, which it was very close to becoming at that point. Interesting that that happened at that time, not long after this battle. Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, when they were popes, gave their full support to this movement of spiritual adoption of the unborn child. What happened was a lady called Wiesza Kowalska found a little prayer of spiritual adoption, and she actually didn't know where it came from. She said that somebody told her they found it in England, but they didn't know quite where and how it had come there. But she looked at this prayer and she said, this is so important, because although Poland is Catholic, I imagine it's very much like St. Lucia. There is an abortion rate, there were a whole lot of things happening, and she thought, we have to really pray. This is a spiritual battle, and you fight a spiritual battle with spiritual means. And here, the killing of the unborn child is influenced by so many spiritually negative factors. Interestingly, she was invited to come to a state school and speak about spiritual adoption, so she did. And when she went into the state school, the children took on prayer for spiritual adoption of the unborn child. Many people started to take it on, and at one point a Polish priest started to pray for an unborn child. It was actually a Pauline priest. He had been praying for 8 months, and he said the prayers each day for the child, but then after 8 months he got sick of it, and he thought, I'm tired, this is just a pious fantasy, I'm not going to keep on doing this. And what happened? That night he went to sleep, and he couldn't really sleep very well, and he had some dreams, and in the dreams there was a car accident, there was a big truck involved, and there was a woman at the side of the road holding a child covered in blood. There was a man, and he didn't know what this meant. He just sort of had these nightmares, but then in the morning he wakes up and a phone call comes. Father, would you come down to the local hospital and fill in because another priest is sick? This was common. So he said, yes, I'll come down. So he rushes down to the local hospital, puts on his coat, gets down there, and the first person he sees when he's in the hospital, in the emergency ward, is the man. He remembered this image of the man in his dreams. And the man said, Father, I've been in a terrible truck accident. It's terrible. I don't know what happened. I barely survived. But he said, could you go and see my wife? She was 8 months pregnant and she had the baby through the shock of the accident. Could you please go and see her and talk to her? So the priest was feeling a bit spooked and went into the maternity ward, and there was the lady he had seen in his dreams with a baby. And she said, Father, this baby almost died last night. I almost died last night in a terrible accident. But you know what? The baby nearly died 8 months ago because my husband and I were going to have an abortion. And we were decided on it because he didn't have a job, we had no prospects, and we couldn't see the way forward. And I went to the door, said this lady, and I put my hand on the knob and I couldn't turn it. She said, I couldn't get out the door. I don't know what stopped me, but like something stopped me. And the priest at that moment, who's listening to her, said to himself, I started praying for this lady 8 months ago, for this child. And he realized at that time, he had some spiritual intuition, this is the child that I prayed for. This is real. This is not a fantasy. When I spiritually adopted the child, that child was saved from death. And he thought afterwards, I will never again doubt that spiritual adoption of the unborn child is real. And he said to people to whom he told this story, he said, tell it wherever you go. Tell this story wherever you go to people, because it's necessary for them to hear what this doubting person went through. Interestingly, there have been many stories associated with spiritual adoption. Wanda Skowronska travelled into the Ukraine and into Russia even, talking about spiritual adoption of the unborn child. In the Ukraine, she described to me how she went to a place called Rovno. Now, there are very few Catholic priests in the Ukraine, but there are quite a few Catholics. Why? Because at the end of World War II, the border was changed. Much more land in the Ukraine, in Poland, was given to the Ukraine. So several million Poles ended up living now in the Ukraine rather than in Poland. But of course, the communist government didn't allow Catholic priests to tend to them. So many years later, there's still maybe one priest for 5,000 people. Really very, very great numbers there. And they love to hear somebody speaking. So Wanda Skowronska went to give a talk about spiritual adoption. But what she found really amazed her. When she started to speak about spiritual adoption, people became very, very upset and they started to cry. And she intuitively understood something's going on here, and she said, I understand that many of you out there have had abortions. And she said, I'm very sorry that you suffered this, that the child suffered this. And at that moment, the whole church, almost to the last person, starts to cry. Can you imagine? There's actually a church with 2,000 people in it because the talk was staggered over 2 days because they couldn't fit everybody in and around the church. Men were crying, women were crying. So she said, I understand many of you out there have had abortions, and it's very sad, and I will pray, let us pray that God will heal anybody who is suffering in that way. So the crying continued for something, she's told me herself, for something like 15, 20 minutes. And then when people began to calm down, she said, I want you perhaps to consider something. You are suffering for the loss of the child through abortions. And I mean, these are people who didn't only have one, sometimes they had 3, 5, 7, some had 20 abortions because they had no contraception. Abortion was used as a method of control, and there was a sense of degradation in the communist era where people thought, oh, they kind of lost a hold of their faith, and then they thought, my life is worth nothing, I'm a piece of rubbish, my child is just rubbish. This is how they used to think. I know that they use these words telling me about that era. And so Wanda Skowronska, the coordinator of spiritual adoption, she said, well, look, I want you to go home tonight and go and name every child of every loss that you have encountered, and then come back tomorrow. So the people did go home, they named it, commended the child to God as she had asked. They came the next day, and then she invited them to spiritually adopt an unborn child. All of them wanted to undertake it. So you had so many people, they were eager, they were not only wanting to eager. And in that way, when I look at it, after she told me this story, I thought, this was like helping the person who was robbed on the way to Jericho. This was the person who so many people walked by. This was the unwanted situation that people didn't want. And yet, all these women who were grieving after abortions, they welcomed that child into their lives. And what happened as time went on, because there were return visits, the women were saying, praying to this unknown, unborn child, and spiritually adopting them is healing me. Now, this is a country where, in the Ukraine, they're very poor, they don't have psychologists, counsellors, and so on. So you imagine, in some mysterious way, the unborn child, and praying for that unborn child, is healing such a deep grief. It's really extraordinary when you think of it, and how God provides in salvation history for people in this way. And there have been many stories about women testifying to the healing of spiritual adoption. Interestingly, I've had a few sort of incidents happen when I went to talk about spiritual adoption of the unborn child. when I was in Poland, I mean, I didn't even know about this. I was visiting one day because my father's Polish and I visited my relations, and I met Wanda Kowalska by accident on the street. And at that moment, a whole flock of storks flew overhead. And I just made what I thought was a witty remark saying, ha 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 ha, somebody's going to have a lot of babies. And I was overwhelmed by my own wit and sitting there laughing, and Viesha's saying, hello, I'm Viesha, and I'm connected with spiritual adoption of the unborn child. I have to add, I was with a friend who knew Viesha, who introduced me, and that's how it happened. And she said, I'm looking for somebody to spread it in places where I can't go. She said, will you do it? And it was at that moment I had to either say yes or no, and I said yes. And that's how it happened that I got involved. When I think of it afterwards, I think God has a sense of humour, sending a whole lot of storks over at that time, because it actually wasn't the time for the storks to fly over. And they're amazing, they're huge birds, you know, they're flying like a flock of, like flotilla of planes flying over. Really quite amazing. But when I started to talk about spiritual adoption of the unborn child, I had some very interesting experiences. You know, once I asked in a parish to speak, and the local parish priest said, no, we don't do that. So I didn't ask again. But then that priest went on a holiday. And at that moment, I met a parishioner who runs the rosary in that parish. He said, why don't you come and talk about spiritual adoption? There wasn't any conspiracy. He just asked me out of the blue. And I said, if you like, but I don't think in that parish they want to hear it. Oh, you never know. So he went to ask the priest who was relieving. And that priest said, yes, come and speak about spiritual adoption. So everything was set. I was amazed. I'm thinking it's a miracle. I'm coming to this big parish to talk about spiritual adoption. And I come to the day before, and on the day, and I get laryngitis, and I get sick, and I'm unable to say one pipsqueak word, not one. And I thought, dear God, you want me to speak, and then you don't allow me to speak. What am I going to do? So I had to cancel it. I rang up and I said, look, I can't speak. I actually sounded like, you know, I don't know, Humphrey Bogart with a throat infection. I really sounded terrible. I couldn't go. So I thought, well, why this? And then during the week, I kept thinking, you know, what is it like to be voiceless? What is it like to be not able to speak and ask somebody for help? If you can ask, at least people can see you. And I thought, that is what the child in the womb is, voiceless. And it was like I was meant to understand that at that moment. As it turned out, the talk was rescheduled the next week, and I gave it. I sounded a bit like what they call a schnapps baritone, but it didn't matter. I spoke, I think, in 3 registers at once, and people understood, and many people were willing to take on spiritual adoption. Many of them were young people who were playing the guitar at the Mass at night, and I thought they wouldn't be interested. No, they said, we would like to help. Once, after a talk I gave, a lady went home and talked to her neighbour, and she said to her, look, you know, I've been to this talk on spiritual adoption. It's really easy. You just say this prayer. You don't have to go to any meetings. You don't do anything. You just say this prayer for 9 months, write the date on the fridge, and then at the end of 9 months you can celebrate and then adopt another one if you like. And the lady was sort of listening to her, and then she told her, you know, I was going to go and have an abortion until you told me about this. And she said, now I'm not going to go and do that. I'm keeping the child. And you never quite know where spiritual adoption will lead you. It's quite an interesting movement, and you are seriously asking God for that child's life. Another time, I was in Papua New Guinea, and I was talking to a youth group. There were 200 young people on the beach, and I remember at some point this huge snake started to crawl just in front of me, and I had no idea what you meant to do when a snake comes crawling so closely. So I just kept talking, and fortunately a young girl came out with an axe and then chopped it in two and took it away. But it wasn't really, you know, the most pleasant experience to have to give a talk under those conditions. Another time, I remember I was talking about spiritual adoption in Australia, and it was in the north of Queensland. and everybody was in the room, and Father Linus and some other pro-life people were there, so he can attest to this. A whole swarm of flies came in. They're called march flies. And they're not only flies, they actually sting you. So I remember while I'm talking, I'm sort of slapping myself and thinking, this is torture. But everybody was suffering. I managed to get through the main body of the talk, and then at that point all of us just ran out of the room and ran up to the house to escape from these marauding flies. It was like Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, but all in mosquitoes or flies, all rolled into one. In any case, we managed to get out and tend to our wounds, and people were bleeding all over the place. Interestingly, one girl in Poland was praying for an unborn child, and she prayed, and 9 months was over, and just at that point she went to her job, and she actually worked in a department that dealt with older people. So she was working in a geriatric unit, and what happened was, at that moment a girl came into her office and said, look, I'm pregnant and I need to find a pregnancy centre, or you know, just any kind of family planning or something like this, or you know, I need advice on what to do about this baby. And the girl was surprised, and she said, And then she spiritually adopted that child, took an interest in the mother, and it turned out that that mother was thinking of having an abortion, and because of the interest of that girl and the prayer spiritually adopting the child, the girl kept the baby, and they have remained friends ever since. You may not see the child that you spiritually adopt. You really may never know who that child is or where it is, but at the end of your life you can be sure that when you die, some people will come up to you and say, thank you for praying for me. And they will try to help you in life, I'm sure. In some mysterious way, the prayer for the unborn child has inscrutable benefits in some way. It's a spiritual interaction. Difficult to describe, a mystery, but it happens. I remember once when I had prayed for an unborn child, and 9 months was up, and I went to sleep, and I could hear some noise. Well, actually, it was a piano playing, but it was very, very loudly in my street in Australia. And I thought, gee, these people are rude. They're playing the piano so loudly. I wish they'd keep quiet. I just want to have a sleep. And then when I actually listened to what was being played, the song was Happy Birthday to You. And I thought, the 9 months of my spiritual adoption of an unborn child are up. Maybe my child is being born somewhere. And I was really quite moved. You may never see this child that you've adopted, but I'm telling you, if you spiritually adopt a child, it will have a wonderful effect on your life. These children are calling to us, unseen and unheard, from another world. Please hear their call, consider spiritual adoption of the unborn child, and if you would like to give a talk such as I have given today, please contact Father Linus. I will leave a copy of the talk for him to give you. If you could spread it to the islands, Martinique, Barbados, and to the others. They may not have this apostolate yet, but it is the simplest, cheapest apostolate you will ever undertake in the history of the Catholic Church, I'm telling you. And the prayer is on a little sheet that you can reproduce. As I said, it takes a minute to begin it and a minute on top of a rosary decade that you may be saying each day. You don't have to say an extra decade. If you're already saying a rosary, just add it before one decade. These children are calling out to you from the other world, and if you are spiritually adopted child, you will set a light in the darkness of our times that will never go out. Thank you for your attention today, and thank you for listening. God bless you all.